Welcome to the first lecture on propaganda. Now, before we get started, you're going to need to go into the Prezi that I shared with you and look at the first two videos because that's going to explain a lot about what I'm going to be talking about to lead in. You need that information to understand what the hell I'm talking about right now. So we see in the short video on defining propaganda that Kent is really kind of trying to dispel the idea of the kind of overwhelming negative interpretation of propaganda, and that propaganda is somewhat neutral. The whole idea is that propaganda is kind of at the whim of who is in power. Okay, now this could be uh, dozens of different entities, from government to high-ranking, uh, officials in an army, or just the super wealthy who can buy influence and things like that. So you want to make sure that you know you're kind of separating the idea of the intent of who is at power using propaganda from the inherent nature of propaganda, which is neutral. Now, of course, we're going to be focusing in on propaganda of war. Um, now, this all kind of revolves around the idea that we need some sort of rallying point. That it's that using propaganda to reinforce narratives, to bolster pre-existing uh, conceptions, and trying to steer the idea of the masses in a certain direction, that all of this is for a common good, from that they're thinking from that we're thinking from the viewpoint of someone in power trying to gain support over the war, so that you don't get what we just saw in the last lecture, which is the protest art. So and this kind of leads into that negative perception of propaganda too, that the idea of governments using propaganda to support something that is inherently violent, that it has those negative effects. And people like to think of themselves as people who have free will and can make decisions on their own. But what we don't realize is that almost every moment of every day, we're being influenced by something beyond us. And that doesn't really sit well with uh, people who value free thought, that people are trying to intrude on that through bent narratives and exaggerated and emotional responses. Now, Chomsky is, talking more about the way that media affects the way that we develop our ideas, and schooling, and the profound influence that has had, not just by the way that um, you're taught to think or whatever, but the way that you're taught to act and behave in this society. So it's what he's talking about is it's kind of a necessary evil for a society, or I'm gonna say it's a necessary evil. You can form your own opinions on that, whether because you need to somehow educate people how to act inside the society and the values of that society, but you're also those those ways that you're teaching the people have influences down the line and affect every decision that they make in their life. So it's really kind of this crazy, long-term effect that we're seeing. Um, but, for the purposes of this right now, we're going to kind of separate out education, advertising, and propaganda. Later on, we're going to look at kind of the interplay of propaganda and advertising, because there is a lot of overlap there. But as we saw in the first video, the intent is different, and the means are somewhat the same. So, without further ado, let's begin. The greatest victory is that which requires no battle. So what we're seeing here is Sun Tzu, talking about the way to really win the battle is to, attack not just the people, but their values, the way they think, and having that sort of influence on their daily life. Now, this is probably the most famous of the Russian propagandist constructivist posters from the early 20s and late teens. We're going to talk a lot about Russian propaganda a little bit later, so I'm not going to go into the whole aesthetics here, but it is important to note that the white represents the anti-communist confederation known as, the whites, essentially. And the red is the Bolsheviks and the communists, and it's talking about defeating the anti-communists with this red wedge, kind of penetrating it, breaking it apart, and really gaining victory over the enemy. Now, propaganda itself has a long history, and a lot of it goes back to ancient societies where we're seeing people trying to win support for their governing body. Here we see Hatshepsut, who was a female pharaoh, and I say pharaoh loosely because they didn't have a term for a female pharaoh. So what we see is, Hatshepsut in the pharaoh role. Now, what she's done here is kind of taken the pharaonic iconography, such as the crown, the pharaonic beard, and things like that, and applied them to herself in the way that she is going to be represented. And this was very important for the way that she was wanting to have herself perceived by the masses. Remember that, a lot of this during this time period, that you're dealing with a widely illiterate base. Nobody can read. So iconography and art is an extremely powerful way to influence and communicate. So here we see her pretty much depicted as a man, and she's bound her breasts down to her chest. You can kind of see them, that they're a little more pronounced than in other depictions of men, but really she's choosing to portray herself as a man to gain more respect and to gain kind of some sort of legitimacy to her reign, which was long and powerful. And she was extremely influential. Even though after her reign, Thutmose III came in and he destroyed all iconography of her because the thought of having a woman pharaoh was just too unsettling to him. Yay, patriarchal societies. Woo! But we also see this in Iran. So here we're looking at Mount Behestan. And this was along the way of a very popular trade route. And trade was really, going through the Middle East at this time, through the Persian empires. Uh, Huge trade routes. This would have been a very well traveled road. And you can see on my blurry image that there is some cutaway here where these images would be. Now, this isn't the only thing uh, on the mountain, but this is really large scale. Okay, think of like giant billboards professing the strength and power of Darius the Great, because that's what you're seeing right here. Now, on other panels, there would have been other writing. There's multiple languages presented, and it's kind of like this is kind of like the Rosetta Stone for cuneiform and Babylonian writing and things like that. But essentially, this is going through a few different phases or a few different types of writing. One theme is his lineage, and it goes back like 20 people. All right, I'm Darius, son of X, son of Y, son of blah, 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 on and on. And then it talks about, uh, all the regions that are in control of Darius the Great. And then we see all of these people that are smaller. These are rulers of those realms, and above each is a little bit of writing. I am Nebuchadnezzar, uh, who lied and said that I was, king of Babylon, and then I was destroyed by Darius the Great. And it kind of professes all these huge, big name rivals that Darius vanquished. So it's literally just taking these very powerful images, and if you look closely, these other kings, they're bound by the neck with a rope. So what you're seeing is this iconography that he's much bigger, they're bound, they're smaller. You have the pairing with writing, and you're going to see that uh, throughout the pairing of imagery and the written word is very common in propagandist techniques. Augustus. So here we're seeing Augustus Caesar predicted, uh, predicted as shown in two different fashions. One, we have the glorious leader who is in an orator's pose. He's a great speaker and a great thinker. He has a cuirass that he wears on his body that shows battles that he's won. There is a direct link to Venus down here, showing his divine lineage. Oh, well, that's Cupid. The divine lineage is of Venus. So he's shown here as a great warrior, a great speaker, and a divine entity. Whereas over here in the Pontifex Maximus, we're seeing a more calm version of him. Okay, yes, he's still idealized, he's still youthful, he's still handsome and strong, but here he's wearing priest robes, showing that he's also a very holy person. You can imagine where these two different uh, statues would be found. That the Pontifex would be in more of a temple setting, and the Augustus of Prima Porta in a more public setting.